In this week's staff, in Taanis, staff Chav Beis, the Gemara speaks about, it goes on the Mishnah, when there's a Tzara Rachman Litzlan and Klal Yisrael, you're supposed to be Goyzer at Taanis. We'll see soon why the title connects to this week's staff. But the Mishnah, the Gemara explains, goes on the Mishnah that you're supposed to fast, make a Taanis during a Tzara. Like the examples, a dever, chayra, it's gepasken la'aloch and shulchan aruch, simin tov kufay and vav, sif hay speaks about on a chayli that you're supposed to make a fast. For an example, during COVID, I don't think there was even a half a minute to do it then, mipnei sakana of anybody fasting, but the concept is clear. On parnasa and sivav, different times you're supposed to make a fast day. Why a fast day? So the Rambam in Hilchas Taanis explains, just going to quote one line, U'medivrei seifrim lehisanois al kol tzora shetavoi al hatzibur ad shirach min hashamayim. You should make a fast day. Why? How the Rambam explains, to do tshuva. To do tshuva. The tzoras come because of chatoim, so to do tshuva, misaken a fast day. This din, to illustrate, to bring it out of Lamaisa, I'm just going to read two letters of the Chofetz Chaim that happened around the 20s. Two different incidents that the Chofetz Chaim writes to be misaken a Taanis. A Taanis for then, b'shas the tzara. One, the Chofetz Chaim says, Hine ara sheniya ba'olam in Yunora shenaga l'chol ha'olam, and Klal Yisrael has to get involved. Chofetz Chaim says, V'hine bin aroi hayu, the right thing would be she is afsru gedolei ador, the gedolei ador of all of Klal Yisrael should get together, ligzor, Taanis, tzibur klali, to make a Taanis tzibur. We're familiar with the Taanis, Sar B'Teva, Shavasa B'Tamas. This that we learn this week, the Mishnah, the Gemara, is negay, it's gepasken and shulchan aruch. The Chofetz Chaim is saying there was a tzara then, and the right thing would be is for all of Klal Yisrael to get together and make a Taanis tzibur. However, he says it's not practical, you need authorization from the government then, and it's not shaykh. So mainly he says everybody, every kehila for themselves should pick a day and be goyz at Taanis, says the Chofetz Chaim, and we picked Erev Rosh Chodesh Elul. But just to bring out this that we're learning is halacha l'maisa clearly. Ve'ena eisnei senes v'anachnu be'ireinu kavanu lezes yom Rosh Chodesh Elul. And then he says every city should pick their time for when Taanis, when to be kavei Taanis. In a different letter, this is in Ma'amarim, which is in the back of Chofetz Chaim al HaTorah. In a different letter, the Chofetz Chaim says, this is in Igros, the Chofetz Chaim says, Hine l'shmua kiba nomas kolev, close to 3 million Yidden heim b'shvi, b'tzara, u'b'tzuka. Says it's unbelievable. Timsa saris rishenu oyem v'noy radavar. V'hine al pidin. This is what we're learning. Al pidin, al gzeirus noiroyis ke'elu, on such gezeiros, hinenu mechiyavim l'sanas, you're supposed to fast. So that's to bring out the concept, to know what we learned, the Gemara, the Mishnah, the Gemara, is halacha l'maisa, that if there's a tzara rachman litzlan, you're supposed to fast. The Taanis, the fast that we fast, now Shavasa B'Tamas, hopefully Tisha B'Av, we're not going to fast, it's going to be a moyed, it's going to be a Yom Tov, we're going to make a Suda. But the concept of Taanis, one would think that a Taanis is on Asara B'Tevis, that they surrounded Shavasa B'Tamas, that they broke the wall, the 5 things we spoke about, what happened, Butal Atamid. Says the Chassam Sofer that it's not the pshat that we fast of what happened. Why? V'haraya. He says the Chachamim can't make up a new idea. Bishleim Chanukah and Purim, this is the famous Chasam Sofer because it's a Kal V'chomer, he says it's the Raisa. We're not going to go into it now. But a Taanis, Eich Motzinu, such a thing of a fast day, ben Torah. So you do find such a thing, Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is not a sad day. As a matter of fact, Yom Kippur is a Yom Simcha. We make a Shechiyanu at the beginning of Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is a Yom Tshuva, to do Tshuva. So says the Chasam Sofer, and he shows a Rambam, read the Lashon Rambam. The Rambam, at the beginning of the 5th parak, the Rambam says, Yesh Yomim Shekol Yisrael Mis'anim Behem, that people fast, but why? Why do we fast? Why did we fast now Shavasa B'Tamas? Kedei la'oirer halavavois uleftoyach darkei hatshuva. The reason we fast is to be ma'oirer to tshuva. How does it accomplish that we're ma'oirer l'tshuva? How will we accomplish that? Because when you fast, you think, why am I fasting? Because of the tzara that happened. And it causes that we should do tshuva, that the tzara shouldn't happen again. So Meila Kum T'chais, the Taanis that we fast is not a Taanis of something that happened. It's just something that happened that reminds us that what we're fasting now is the tzara that happened, that we should do tshuva, it shouldn't happen again. Says the Chasam Sofer, that's why you see that we say slichas on a day of a Taanis. We say slichas, the slichas is to do tshuva. The Shlosh speaks about it. The Shlosh says that it's for a Taanis is not of what happened. Avada not. There's no ta'elis to be sad. What happened? Why are we being sad? It's to do tshuva. The whole tachlis of a Taanis is to do tshuva. The Aruch HaShulchan says the same, and the Aruch HaShulchan says that on a Taanis, the Haftorah of Dirshu is also for tshuva. So what comes out, before we continue on, what comes out very clearly, that what we learned over here, that to be koveya, Taanis on a Yom Tzara, and the Taanis that we actually fast, the Taanesim, is all the same idea, to do tshuva b'shas ha-Taanis. After World War II, after the Holocaust, there was a big discussion of maybe adding in a Yom Taanis. A Yom Taanis, obviously the Yom Taanis wouldn't be as a memorial of the Holocaust, but actually the concept, just like we have the other Taanesim, that we fast and remember the tzara that happened and do tshuva now, the same thing, to be koveya one day of the year, a day to fast. On the 6 million Kedoshim that were killed, a Kiddush Hashem, to remember that and fast whatever day it will be, to remember to do tshuva. The Chazon Ish, in a letter, writes very strongly against it. Not to be koveya Taanis. And he says, a Taanis that we have, the Taanesim that we have, came about from the Nevi'im. The Nevi'im gave us a mitzvah, how he says it, a mitzvah of Taanis. Bizman hazeh, we don't have Nevi'im, we can't be mechadish a mitzvah of Taanis. Of course, like what we mentioned before from the Chasam Sofer, that where did the Nevi'im get the idea of the mitzvah? From Yom Kippur, but they extended it to other Taanesim. We can't go and be mechadish a new mitzvah of Taanis. Chazon Ish. They bring Mepi Shmur from the Briskerov. The Briskerov was asked the same thing about being koveya Taanis, and the Briskerov said that in the Kinnos on Tisha B'Av it's already mevur not to. Where do you see it? Kina Chaf Hey, that we say on Tisha B'Av in the morning, the Kina says, just to understand, this Kina doesn't speak about the Churban Beis HaMikdash, it speaks about the Crusaders. It doesn't speak about the Churban Abayis. Within the Kina asks a question. It's very interesting. Why am I speaking about different tsaras, not the Churban Abayis? That's what he asks. And he says, you know why? V'chi ein lahoisef moyed, you can't add on out of Tisha B'Av shever v'saveira. You can't add on out of Tisha B'Av another day of, so to speak, of mourning, of tsar, and therefore that's why I plugged it in Tisha B'Av. Zokte Briskerov, this is the answer. Ein lahoisef moyed shever v'saveira, you can't add on. So if you can't add on, we don't add on another day. There's no other day of Taanis to be misana on the Holocaust. That's what the Briskerov said. It's interesting to note, the exact same thing was said also from the Friedrich Belzer Rebbe, Rabbi Belzer. They asked him the question, they asked him about adding on a Yom Taanis. And he said, it says you're not allowed to. They didn't know where it says. And he said, he showed them right here in the kid of Ein Lahoisef. Agav, you see what a level it is when saying the Kinnos, not only to understand when we're saying the Kinnos, but even they remembered it as remembering Shulchan Aruch, that the Briskerov brought a raya from the Kinnos not to be Moisef a Taanis. Reb Moshe also has a tshuva about it, and Reb Moshe was asked the same question. Reb Moshe was asked if to add, we should add a Yom Taanis. Again, this whole discussion is not the Mishnah and the Gemara that we learn now, b'shas the tzara. Here we're talking about after the tzara, b'doimet ta'awat hanesim. But b'shas the tzara, avad, if there would have been a discussion during World War II if to make a Yom Taanis, so there wouldn't be any of this discussion. You're not allowed to fakir. The Gemara says yetu, gepask in the Shulchan Aruch. This is later to plug in a day of what happened. Rav Moshe was asked this question, and Rav Moshe answered with a question. He said, you can add a Taanis. So he says, how could it be you can't add a Taanis? We see Chaf Sivan is a Yom Taanis. We once spoke about it over here, the whole history and the background. Chaf Sivan, Gvaldige Tzaras and Klal Yisrael. And it's a Yom Taanis. So what do you tell me you can't add? Just like they made a day, a Yom Taanis on Chaf Sivan. So let's make a Taanis. Now, after the Holocaust, a Yom Taanis, b'doimet to Chaf Sivan. Zokter Moshe, and this is an explanation why we don't add another day of Taanis. Why takanat? The Kinnos says ein lahoisef, but why takanat? Why takanat? Zokter Moshe, all tsaras in Klal Yisrael is all an offshoot of that we don't have a Beis Hamikdash. Because we don't have a Beis Hamikdash, we don't have the Avodah, we don't have the Carbon Tamid, the Meila, these all the tsaras, sicknesses, everything that happens is all because there's no Beis Hamikdash. If there would be a Beis Hamikdash, there would be no tsaras. Meila says Rav Moshe like this: Ein lahoisef, because anything of any tzara that happened is always included in Tisha B'Av. It's included in Tisha B'Av. When we're being misabel Tisha B'Av on the base, the Churban Beis Hamikdash, included in that is any other tzara, because that comes from the Churban Abayis. So are you going to ask me Chaf Sivan? What happened about Chaf Sivan? Chaf Sivan should also be. So Rav Moshe said Chaf Sivan was something that happened to a certain kihila. It wasn't a tzara for all of Klal Yisrael. It happened in Ukraine. Avad was a geferliche tzara. Ad Kedei Kach, he says that there were different governments that tried to get involved to stop the tzara. Very interesting. Rav Moshe writes, goes through a bit of the history. Therefore, being that it's a tzara that's only for a certain chelik of Klal Yisrael, but it's not a tzara throughout Klal Yisrael, therefore, that kehila couldn't adopt that it should be a Yom Taanis. Al Kopanim, what do we have so far very clearly? to be kaveya Taanis during a tzara that's dina dashas. The Taanisim that we have is the same idea, also to be ma'orel l'tshuva, to make a Taanis after on a tzara that was. We see over here from the Gedolim not to do it. There's one more pointer to go to is Lagabi adding in Kinnos. What's about adding a Kinnos for what happened in World War II? A Taanis we saw, like it says in the Kinnos, V'chi ein lehoisef. So first of all, to read the lashon of the Seder Hayoim, the Seder Hayoim says in general that you could add your own Kinnos. He's speaking about Churban Abayis, but you can add your own Kinnos. The Seder Hayoim says, "Umitzvahi al kol adam lechaber kinim vehege v'loy miraisa b'yoy b'marazeh." He doesn't say about adding a Kinnos about World War II, but he says any person can add on Tisha B'Av his own. He could add his own Kinnos that'll be ma'orim in the Churban Abayis, to mourn, to be misabel in the Churban Abayis. Rashi on Divrei Hayomim, the Chidah actually says it's not Rashi, but Al Kapanim, what we have, the Mafarish, the Rashi on Divrei Hayomim. Rashi says, Dugma, I'm just pulling out the words that are relevant, Dugma b'Tisha B'Av shemaskirim Kinnos ala harugim b'gzeira she'iru b'yameinu. Says Rashi, just like Tisha B'Av, we add in other tzaras b'yameinu, the crusade, the time of Rashi, the tzaras, that's that kina actually. So we add in other kinas, other shtiklach, not the Churban Abayis. Reb Vosner's son, he's already not alive, Reb Chaim Meir, who was his oldest son who took him over, his raya is from that kina itself, that the kina says, V'chi ein lehoisef, but even though you can't be moisef a different day of Taanis, or a different day to be misabel, however, on Tisha B'Av itself, that piece doesn't speak about the Churban. So you see, you could be moisef. This concept of being moisef pieces, kinos into the kina, the misabel on Tisha B'Av, was a big discussion in the 1980s. Somebody by the name of Rav Pinchas Herzka, he was the one who made a tumble about it. He went around, and these haskamas from Gedoyle Olam throughout to add in to people that could should write up a kina about the Holocaust, about World War II. I have a list of some: Rav Moshe, Rav Gifter of Ruderman, the Blujev Rebbe. I wrote it down. Rav Shlomo Zalman, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, Debetziner Rav. Many signed approving the idea of adding in, of writing a kina. Lamaisa, I have a collection I put together of some of the different kinos that people wrote. Some of them actually very famous. One of them, the Baba Rebbe, wrote a kina. It's actually, this we give out over here, but just, it's a very easy to read. He speaks about what happened, and it's interesting actually, in one of the pieces, he writes that the Churban was a Churban throughout, for the Chassidim, for the Bnei Yeshivas, throughout all. In other words, it was a tzara throughout all of Klal Yisrael. Rav Schwab wrote a kina. Actually, I met his Einikel last night. He gave me a copy of it. I mean, it's available. Could be it's in some printed, some of the kinas. Reb Vosner wrote it actually in 1984. He was in Switzerland. He wrote a kina. Their lawyer of, among others, that wrote a kina. I have copies of whoever wants to take a look. It's interesting to note, however, that Reb Shach at the time was against it. And Reb Shach explained, it's true what we saw, that on Tisha B'Av you should add pieces of Kinnos that reflect other tzaras in Klal Yisrael. However, if today there's going to be a takana on Klal Yisrael to add this, tomorrow there's going to be a takana to add something else, and the third day there's going to be a takana to take off something, to make davening shorter. So Meli he wrote, it's written of, he says very stark, not to add anything. Just also to read one line. I'm skipping around. Today, anyone thinks they understand better. I have to speak out about it. That people, young people come and they start making takanas and adding things in. So Mela, he was opposed not to make new kinas. But just to point out, on this Reb Shach said not to, there's a letter that just went out, that was actually on auction, but a letter from Reb Vosner, who he himself wrote one about the Holocaust. He writes in the letter, I have a copy of the letter, he writes that I spoke to Reb Shach and I explained to him, it's not that we're making a takana on Klal Yisrael, that everybody has to pick one kino. In other words, to stick it in, that this is now, there used to be 40 pieces, this is the piece 41. But actually, everybody should choose a piece that they can connect to be moisef. It doesn't say that he was maskim, but that's in the letter. And the same thing also, Moshe Sternbach, Shlita, writes also, he opposes the concept of being koveya to put in a certain kina bizman hazeh that should be part of it. Though we find in the zman of the Rishonim they did add in. Today we're not on the level to add something that all of Klal Yisrael should adopt. However, to say that all of Klal Yisrael should choose to say something to remember that, yeah. So just to conclude and go back to the point we spoke about, we started off when we spoke about a Taanis, bizman tzara, that's definitely. The Taanesim that we have is the same idea, to remember a tzara, and do tshuva. To add a Taanis on what happened, we saw from the Gedolim not to. However, to add a kina to remember, to add it on Tisha B'Av, Baskomas, almost all the Gedolim definitely to do so. And Memela, Avada, if someone could connect these many different kinas that were written up to remember the Churban HaAchron, Memela, if somebody could say, of course you should say, have a wonderful Shabbos.